A ceasefire is the most effective hiding place in geopolitics, not because it conceals military activity, though it does that too, but because it conceals intent. It creates a public narrative of restraint and diplomacy that absorbs the world's analytical attention, while the decisions that actually determine what comes next are being made in the spaces that the ceasefire's narrative has cleared of scrutiny. Every major actor in a conflict understands this. They understand that a ceasefire is not just a military arrangement. It is an information environment, one that is actively managed to direct attention toward the surface of the situation and away from the structural developments underneath it. And what is developing underneath this specific ceasefire is not a minor adjustment to the conflict's trajectory. It is something larger, more deliberate, and more consequential than anything that has happened during the active combat phase. It is already in motion. And the ceasefire is why most of the world has not yet seen it. My name is Professor Jiang Xueqin, and if you want to understand what is being hidden by this ceasefire, why it is bigger than the conflict it appears to have paused, and what the consequences look like when it becomes visible, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now, because this is the structural analysis that sees past the ceasefire's surface to what the ceasefire is actually concealing. In this video, we are going to answer 3 precise questions. What specifically is the ceasefire hiding? What makes it bigger than the conflict it has paused? And why is it already in motion rather than still in preparation? Who are the decisive actors whose activities during the ceasefire's cover are creating the conditions for what comes next? And what is the real logic driving their decisions beneath the diplomatic language of restraint and peace? And from this point forward, what are the realistic scenarios? The path on which what the ceasefire is hiding becomes visible at a moment and in a form that the existing response architectures are unprepared to address. The path on which early recognition produces a meaningful intervention in the process that is already underway, and the strategic wild card that could change the entire logic of the situation before the hidden development reaches its intended conclusion. By the end of this video, the ceasefire you have been watching will look fundamentally different to you. Not as the beginning of a resolution, but as the cover operation for something that has been in planning far longer than the ceasefire itself. Let us begin with the context reset, because understanding what this ceasefire is hiding requires understanding the specific function that ceasefires serve in the strategic logic of the actors who agree to them. The conventional understanding of a ceasefire is that it is a pause, a moment when the parties to a conflict step back from active combat to create space for negotiation, for humanitarian relief, or for the kind of diplomatic engagement that active combat makes impossible. That understanding is accurate as far as it goes, but it is incomplete in a specific and consequential way. A ceasefire does not only create space for the activities it is publicly described as enabling, it creates space for every activity that the active combat phase was consuming the resources and attention to sustain. Military reconstitution, alliance restructuring, economic repositioning, strategic planning, and in this specific case, the execution of a process that is larger than the conflict the ceasefire has paused, a process whose scale and significance makes the active combat phase look, in retrospect, like the preparation rather than the main event. Here is what has literally just happened that makes this ceasefire's concealment function so structurally significant. In the weeks immediately preceding the ceasefire's announcement, a sequence of developments occurred that was almost entirely invisible in the coverage of the lead-up to the ceasefire itself, because the coverage was focused on the negotiations, the terms, the monitoring arrangements, and the diplomatic credit claiming that ceasefires generate. While that coverage was absorbing the world's analytical attention, 3 separate but connected processes were being finalized. A financial architecture was being completed, a set of arrangements among multiple actors that restructures the economic relationships of the conflict zone in ways that create permanent dependencies favoring specific external powers. A political transition framework was being agreed, not publicly, not in the negotiations that generated the ceasefire, but in the back-channel process that the ceasefire's diplomatic activity was simultaneously concealing and facilitating. And a military repositioning was being executed. Not a demobilization, not the kind of repositioning that a genuine de-escalation produces, but a repositioning that places specific capabilities in specific locations that only make strategic sense if the party executing it anticipates a future operational requirement that the ceasefire has temporarily suspended rather than permanently removed. These 3 processes together constitute what the ceasefire is hiding. And they are not in preparation, They are in execution. The prior context that makes the concealment so effective is the specific credibility that this ceasefire has accumulated by appearing to deliver on its stated promises. The monitoring mechanisms are functioning. The casualty reports have decreased. The humanitarian corridors are operating. All of the visible indicators of a genuine ceasefire are present and verifiable. That is precisely what makes the concealment so sophisticated. It is not a fake ceasefire in the sense of a ceasefire that is being immediately and visibly violated. It is a genuine ceasefire in its military dimensions and a cover operation in its strategic dimensions simultaneously. The actors executing the hidden processes have been careful to maintain the ceasefire's military credibility precisely because maintaining it is what preserves the information environment that makes the hidden processes invisible. The media narrative is covering this ceasefire as a diplomatic story with a humanitarian subtext. Who negotiated it, whether it is holding, what the prospects for a more durable settlement are, and what the civilian populations in the conflict zone are experiencing in the absence of active combat. All of that coverage is real and important. What it is not doing, what it is structurally incapable of doing within the domain-specific, surface-focused framework of standard conflict journalism, is connecting the financial architecture developments, the political transition framework negotiations, and the military repositioning activities into the combined picture they constitute. That picture is not visible from any single journalistic domain. It is visible only through cross-domain synthesis of the kind that this channel exists to perform. Now let us build the power map, because what the ceasefire is hiding is being built by specific actors with specific purposes, and understanding their real calculations is the foundation of understanding what is coming. Start with the primary actor whose strategic interests are most advanced by the hidden process that the ceasefire is concealing. This is an actor that entered the conflict with objectives that were always larger than the specific territorial or political outcomes that the conflict's surface narrative described. The surface narrative, the publicly stated objectives, the defined military goals, the diplomatic positions maintained throughout the active combat phase, was always the visible layer of a strategic agenda whose deeper layer involved a fundamental restructuring of the regional power architecture. The ceasefire is the moment at which the transition from the visible layer to the deeper layer is being executed. The active combat phase established the conditions, the exhaustion of opposing parties, the demonstration of military capability, the positioning of external support relationships that the deeper agenda requires. The ceasefire is when the deeper agenda's execution begins. This actor's biggest constraint is time. The window during which the ceasefire's information environment provides cover for the hidden processes is finite, and the processes must reach irreversibility before that window closes and the full picture becomes visible to the actors whose response could interrupt them. Look at the United States. Washington's engagement with this ceasefire has been primarily focused on the surface layer. The monitoring mechanisms, the humanitarian dimensions, the diplomatic framework, and the prospects for a more durable settlement that the ceasefire might enable. That focus is not a failure of American intelligence in the narrow sense. The raw information about the financial architecture, the political transition framework, and the military repositioning exists in the American intelligence system. The failure is in the integration of that information into a policy-relevant assessment of what the ceasefire is actually concealing, and in the translation of that assessment into a response posture that addresses the hidden processes rather than the visible surface. The biggest constraint on Washington is the analytical and institutional gap between intelligence collection and strategic synthesis. The same gap that this channel has described in the context of other missed signals, and that the ceasefire's information environment has been specifically designed to exploit. Washington is also constrained by the domestic political appeal of the ceasefire's surface narrative, a narrative of reduced casualties, diplomatic progress, and potential resolution that is politically valuable to an administration navigating the domestic pressures of sustained conflict engagement, and that creates institutional incentives against the kind of analytical reassessment that would undermine the narrative's political value. Look at the actor whose position within the conflict zone is being restructured by the hidden political transition framework. This actor has accepted the political transition framework not because it believes the framework serves its interests optimally, but because it has made a calculation that the alternative, continued active combat without the external support that the framework's acceptance secures, is worse. That calculation may be correct, or it may reflect an incomplete picture of the framework's long-term implications for this actor's autonomy and operational freedom. What is clear is that the calculation was made under conditions of significant information asymmetry. The actor that designed the framework has significantly more clarity about its long-term implications than the actor that accepted it. The asymmetry of understanding about what has been agreed is itself a hidden feature of the hidden process, and it creates a time-delayed vulnerability for the accepting actor whose full consequences will not be visible until the framework's implementation is further advanced. Look at the regional powers, whose positions are being restructured by the financial architecture that the ceasefire is concealing. Each of the significant regional actors is now operating in a financial environment that is being reshaped around them. Trade relationships, energy payment mechanisms, infrastructure investment dependencies, and currency arrangements that were already in transition are being accelerated and consolidated during the ceasefire's cover in ways that will present the regional actors with completed facts rather than negotiable arrangements when the ceasefire's information environment eventually lifts. The regional actors that are most directly affected by this financial restructuring are those whose economic relationships with the Western-led financial architecture are most extensive, because the restructuring is specifically designed to create alternatives to those relationships that reduce the coercive leverage that Western financial institutions and sanctions regimes have historically provided. Look at China, because its role in all three of the hidden processes is the most structurally significant of any external actors, and it is the role that most directly determines whether the ceasefire's concealment function succeeds or is interrupted. China is the primary architect of the financial architecture being completed during the ceasefire. The comprehensive set of payment mechanisms, currency arrangements, and infrastructure investment dependencies that are being finalized in the conflict zone and its surrounding region. China is also a silent but significant participant in the political transition framework, not as a visible negotiating party, but as the external guarantor whose economic relationships with the primary actor executing the hidden process give the framework its durability and its enforcement mechanism. And China is the external power whose military repositioning in adjacent theaters is creating the operational context within which the conflict zone's military repositioning makes strategic sense. Understanding China's role across all three dimensions of the hidden process is the analytical key to understanding what the ceasefire is hiding at its deepest structural level. Now let us turn to the structural facts, the hard, verifiable realities that explain why what the ceasefire is hiding is bigger than the conflict it has paused, and why it is already in motion rather than still in preparation. Structural fact number 1. The financial architecture being completed during the ceasefire creates structural dependencies that are more durable and more strategically consequential than any military outcome the active combat phase could have produced. Military outcomes, territorial control, force structure changes, operational precedents are reversible through subsequent military activity, diplomatic negotiation, or economic pressure. Financial architecture, payment system integration, infrastructure investment dependency, currency arrangement embedding creates physical and institutional facts whose reversal requires either the destruction of the infrastructure itself or the construction of an entirely alternative architecture to replace it. Neither reversal mechanism is available on a politically relevant timescale once the financial architecture has reached operational maturity. The ceasefire is providing the time for that maturation to occur, and it is occurring faster than the analytical frameworks tracking the conflict's financial dimensions are recognizing. Structural fact number 2, the political transition framework being agreed during the ceasefire is designed to produce a governance reality in the conflict zone that is irreversible through the diplomatic mechanisms available to the actors whose interests it disadvantages. Political transition frameworks that are executed during ceasefires that create new administrative structures, new institutional relationships, and new chains of political authority are extremely difficult to reverse once they have been in place long enough to generate the bureaucratic and economic dependencies that institutional embedding produces. The actors whose interests are disadvantaged by the framework have the diplomatic option of refusing to recognize it, but non-recognition of an operational political reality has a consistently poor track record as an instrument of reversal. It is a position that is politically sustainable in the short term and strategically ineffective over the medium and long term. Structural fact number 3. The military repositioning occurring during the ceasefire is creating operational facts that change the risk calculus of every actor contemplating military activity in the conflict zone and its surrounding region for years after the ceasefire resolves. Military presence, even at a scale that does not constitute a large-scale deployment, creates specific operational constraints: detection tripwires, response commitment implications, logistics infrastructure that must be factored into every subsequent operational plan by every actor whose interests might require military activity in the relevant theater. The repositioning is sized and positioned not to deter a specific imminent threat, but to create the operational architecture within which the political transition framework can be implemented without military interruption. It is the enforcement mechanism of the hidden political process, and its effectiveness does not depend on its being large, but on its being in the right place. Structural fact number 4, the simultaneity of the 3 hidden processes: financial architecture completion, political transition framework agreement, and military repositioning, is the specific feature that makes what the ceasefire is hiding bigger than the conflict it has paused. Each process individually would be significant. Their simultaneous execution, coordinated to reach irreversibility within the same window of ceasefire cover, produces a combined strategic outcome whose significance is multiplicative rather than additive. The financial architecture creates the economic basis for the political transition. The political transition creates the governance structure through which the financial architecture's dependencies are administered. And the military repositioning creates the security environment within which both can operate without interruption. Each reinforces the others, and all 3 reaching irreversibility together produces a strategic transformation that would have been impossible to achieve through any single process operating alone or through any combination of the 3 processes operating sequentially rather than simultaneously. Structural fact number 5, the precedent effect of a successfully executed simultaneous 3-process concealment during a ceasefire is the most consequential and most durable strategic consequence of the ceasefire's concealment function. If the financial architecture, political transition framework, and military repositioning all reach irreversibility during the ceasefire's window without triggering a response adequate to interrupt any of them, the template that has been demonstrated, the use of a credible ceasefire as the cover for a simultaneous multi-process strategic transformation, will be recognized and replicated in every subsequent conflict where a major power has the analytical sophistication and the institutional coordination capacity to execute it. The precedent is not just about this conflict, it is about the future of ceasefire as an instrument of international order, whether it remains a framework for genuine de-escalation or becomes a recognized mechanism for the concealed execution of strategic transformations that visible conflict would not have permitted. From this point, 3 scenarios are possible. Let me walk through each with the precision this moment demands. Scenario A is the completed concealment path, the path on which all 3 hidden processes reach irreversibility within the ceasefire's window. The transformation they collectively produce becomes visible only after the point at which it can be interrupted has passed, and the post-ceasefire environment is one in which every actor must respond to a completed strategic transformation rather than a contestable process. This is the scenario that the ceasefire's design is optimized to produce, and it is the scenario whose probability is highest given the current state of the analytical and response frameworks of the actors whose interests the transformation disadvantages. In this scenario, the ceasefire eventually resolves through a more formal agreement, through a resumption of limited hostilities, or through a transition to a frozen conflict, and the resolution reveals a conflict zone whose financial, political, and military architecture has been fundamentally restructured during the ceasefire's cover in ways that the resolution process must now accommodate rather than contest. The international response to this scenario is the management of completed facts rather than the interruption of an ongoing process, a reactive posture that is systematically less effective than an anticipatory one. Scenario B is the interrupted concealment path, the path on which the cross-domain synthesis of the financial architecture, political transition framework, and military repositioning evidence produces a recognition sufficiently early and sufficiently senior level to authorize a response that interrupts at least one of the 3 hidden processes before it reaches irreversibility. The interruption of any single process disrupts the mutual reinforcement architecture that makes the simultaneous 3-process approach so effective. because each process depends on the others reaching completion simultaneously. Interrupting one creates a timing gap that gives the actors whose interests are disadvantaged additional time to contest the remaining processes. This scenario requires a specific convergence of analytical recognition speed and political authorization speed that is more demanding than the existing institutional architecture routinely produces. But that is achievable if the analytical community assembles the cross-domain picture and delivers it to decision makers with the authority and the political will to act on it within the relevant time frame. Scenario C is the negotiated incorporation wildcard, the path on which the primary actor executing the hidden processes, recognizing that the ceasefire's concealment window is narrowing and that the risk of recognition-triggered interruption is rising, makes a deliberate choice to surface the hidden processes through a negotiated framework that incorporates their outcomes into a formal settlement rather than attempting to complete them entirely under ceasefire cover. This scenario produces a worse outcome for the actors whose interests are disadvantaged than the completed concealment path, because the negotiated incorporation of the hidden processes outcomes gives those outcomes formal legitimacy and international recognition. But it produces a better outcome than the interrupted concealment path from the executing actor's perspective, because it salvages the strategic gains of the hidden processes even if it does not deliver them at full value. Watch for the signal of this scenario activating in a sudden shift in the executing actor's public diplomatic posture, a move from the restraint and process management language of ceasefire diplomacy to the more assertive framing of specific outcome demands that indicates a decision to surface rather than conceal. Let me now bring this directly home, because what the ceasefire is hiding connects to your daily life through channels that are specific, concrete, and worth understanding clearly. The energy and economic channel is the most immediate. The financial architecture being completed during the ceasefire includes specific arrangements that restructure the pricing, routing, and payment mechanisms for energy from the conflict region and its surrounding area. Those restructured arrangements do not just affect the actors directly involved in them. They affect the global energy market's pricing architecture by introducing alternative payment and routing mechanisms that reduce the effectiveness of the Western-led financial system's ability to use energy market access as a coercive instrument. The long-term consequence for energy consumers in Western economies is a market environment in which the tools that have historically been used to stabilize energy prices through sanctions and financial pressure are less effective, which means the risk premium embedded in energy prices is permanently elevated relative to the pre-ceasefire environment. The financial system stability channel reflects the consequences of the payment mechanism and currency arrangement components of the financial architecture being completed during the ceasefire. The integration of conflict zone and regional economies into alternative payment systems reduces the dollar-denominated financial system's reach in ways that compound over time. Each integration reduces the marginal cost of the next integration, and the cumulative effect of multiple regional integrations is a structural reduction in the dollar system's global dominance that affects American borrowing costs, the effectiveness of American financial sanctions, and the long-term purchasing power of dollar-denominated assets. For anyone whose savings, retirement accounts, or investment holdings are denominated in dollars or dependent on American financial system primacy, the financial architecture being completed during this ceasefire is a direct and compounding long-term financial exposure. The governance and institutional channel is where the political transition framework's consequences are most directly felt at the level of the international system's capacity to manage future conflicts. A political transition framework that is executed during a ceasefire's cover and that produces governance facts that the international community must subsequently accommodate rather than contest establishes a specific precedent for how political outcomes can be achieved without the formal international process that the existing institutional framework requires. That precedent degrades the institutional framework's authority in ways that make every subsequent conflict's political resolution harder to achieve through legitimate multilateral processes, because every actor contemplating a similar approach now has a demonstrated template and a reduced expectation of effective international response. The security and alliance architecture channel reflects the consequences of the military repositioning component of the hidden process for the operational environment of every actor whose security depends on the existing regional military balance. A military repositioning that creates new operational constraints on actors whose freedom of action, the existing architecture, was designed to protect changes the security calculation of those actors in ways that require increased defense investment, modified operational operational planning, and potentially fundamental reconsideration of the alliance relationships that the existing architecture underpins. Those changes impose real costs in defense spending, in strategic attention, and in the political management of alliance relationships under stress that flow through to the fiscal and political environments of the countries bearing them. My read on the current moment is this: the ceasefire is hiding something bigger than the conflict it has paused, and what it is hiding is already in motion, not in preparation, not in planning, but in active execution across three simultaneous processes that are each approaching the irreversibility threshold at different rates. The financial architecture is the most advanced, probably within weeks of the threshold. The political transition framework is at an intermediate stage, with its core elements agreed, but its implementation requiring the cover of several additional weeks of ceasefire stability. The military repositioning is the most recently initiated, but it is advancing at a pace that will bring it to operational maturity within the same window as the other two processes if the ceasefire holds. Short term, the critical analytical task is the cross-domain synthesis of the evidence for all three processes into the combined picture they constitute, and the delivery of that picture to decision makers at a level of seniority and with a degree of analytical clarity that authorizes a response within the remaining window. Long term, the outcome of this ceasefire's concealment function will determine whether the simultaneous multi-process ceasefire cover template becomes a recognized and widely replicated instrument of strategic transformation, or whether the analytical and institutional response to this specific use of it produces the adaptations required to make it less effective in future conflicts. The ceasefire is hiding something bigger. It is already in motion. The window for seeing it clearly enough to interrupt it is open, but narrowing at the rate determined by the maturation speed of the three processes it is concealing. The analytical work of assembling the cross-domain picture is the most important strategic task of this specific moment. More important than any monitoring of the ceasefire's military dimensions, more important than any diplomatic engagement with its surface framework, and more consequential for what the post-ceasefire environment looks like than any of the visible negotiations that are consuming the bulk of the world's analytical attention. Do not follow the ceasefire's surface. Follow what the ceasefire's surface is designed to conceal. Follow the financial architecture signals, the political transition framework indicators, and the military repositioning evidence that together constitute the actual story of this moment. The story that the ceasefire exists, in part, to prevent from being told before it is too late to matter. If you want to continue receiving this kind of structural, precise analysis before the events that confirm it have occurred, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so the next analysis reaches you when it matters most. News changes fast, structures change slow, know the difference, and that is precisely what we are here for.